The transparent spires of Neopomeris gleamed in the twin sunset of Silaris, casting prismatic reflections across the biotech forest that enveloped the city's lower levels. Dr. Alira Voss stood at the panoramic window of the Oculus Research Center, her slender fingers tracing the outline of the distant mountains on the glass. Today marked the culmination of 15 years of work, a neural bridge between human consciousness and the collective mind of the indigenous Scylar species. "A beautiful view," came a deep voice from behind her. "Though I suspect you're seeing equations rather than scenery." Alira turned to find Kale Solaris leaning against the doorframe, his military posture barely concealed beneath civilian clothes. The security specialist had been assigned to the Oculus project 6 months ago, and his perpetual vigilance still made her uneasy. "Beauty and equations aren't mutually exclusive," she replied, gesturing toward the horizon where crystalline structures merged seamlessly with living trees. The Scylar understood that long before we arrived. Their collective consciousness evolved to perceive mathematical patterns in nature as instinctively as we perceive colors. Kale stepped into the room, his cybernetic left eye scanning the laboratory equipment with methodical precision. "And tonight we celebrate plugging our minds into theirs. What could possibly go wrong?" "We're not plugging in anything," Alira said, her voice taking on the patient tone she reserved for skeptics. "The connection gate merely creates a translation matrix between neural patterns. Think of it as a conversation, not an invasion. I've been in enough war zones to know that even conversations can turn dangerous when the participants don't fully understand each other." Kale picked up a neural interface headset, examining its delicate filaments. The Scylar agreed to this experiment rather quickly for a species that deliberates for months over whether to relocate a single tree. Alira reclaimed the headset from his hands. "They're curious about us just as we are about them. The difference is they think collectively, while we remain stubbornly individualistic. Tonight's initialization is just the first step toward genuine understanding." The laboratory door slid open again, admitting Dr. Mira Thane, the civil engineer whose corporate backing had made the Oculus project possible. Her tailored bioluminescent suit pulsed with soft blue light that matched her calculating eyes. "The shareholders are arriving," Mira announced, her gaze sweeping critically over Alira's simple research attire. "Shouldn't our lead neurologist be wearing something more ceremonial? This is a historic occasion, after all." Alira suppressed a sigh. "The Scylar don't care about our fashion choices, Mira. They'll be evaluating the neural resonance patterns, not our appearance. The Scylar may not care, but the people controlling our funding certainly do." Mira's smile didn't reach her eyes. 3 government representatives and 7 corporate investors are expecting a spectacle worthy of their investment. We need this to work flawlessly. "Science isn't about flawless performances," Alira countered. "It's about careful observation and—" "Save the philosophy for after we secure the next round of funding," Mira interrupted. "The demonstration begins in 2 hours. I need you both ready to impress." She turned on her heel and left, the door hissing shut behind her. Kale raised an eyebrow. "And people wonder why I prefer the straightforward hostility of combat zones." Despite herself, Alira laughed. "At least in battle you can see your enemies coming." "Exactly." Kale's expression turned serious. "But tonight, we're connecting to something none of us can fully see or understand. Promise me you'll proceed with caution." Alira nodded, though her mind was already racing ahead to the neural calibrations she needed to complete. "I always do." 2 hours later, the Oculus Center's grand atrium buzzed with anticipation. Holographic displays showcased the project's history and potential applications, while serving drones circulated with exotic refreshments. The gathered dignitaries, a mix of Earth government officials, corporate sponsors, and Solaris colonial administrators, conversed in excited clusters beneath the massive crystalline dome. Alira stood at the entrance to the atrium, mentally reviewing the demonstration protocol. The actual connection gate was housed in a secure chamber below, where 10 Scylar volunteers waited in their customary meditative posture. Above, a scaled neural interface would allow the human audience to witness a simplified version of the consciousness exchange. "Show time," Mira whispered, suddenly appearing at Alira's side. "Remember, keep the technical jargon to a minimum. These people want to hear about unifying worlds and advancing civilization, not synaptic transfer rates." Before Alira could respond, a subtle vibration passed through the floor. The biotech roots that supported the building were shifting, a common occurrence as the semi-sentient flora adjusted to environmental changes. Yet something about this movement felt different, more purposeful than the usual gentle swaying. Kale noticed it too. His hand instinctively moved toward the concealed weapon at his hip. "Normal fluctuation?" "Should be," Alira murmured, though uncertainty crept into her voice. The Siler said the forest might respond to the increased neural activity. Mira clapped her hands, drawing everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, tonight marks a watershed moment in interspecies communication. For centuries, humanity has wondered if we are alone in the universe. Then we discovered the Scylar, whose consciousness exists as a collective rather than individual minds. And now, thanks to the brilliant work of Dr. Alira Voss and her team, we stand on the threshold of true understanding." The audience applauded politely as Alira stepped forward, looking out at their expectant faces. She was struck by how little they grasped what was actually happening. They saw the connection gate as merely another technological triumph, a way to extract knowledge or resources from a new source. None of them understood what it meant to touch the edges of a consciousness that had evolved over millennia to think as one. "Thank you for joining us tonight," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "What you're about to witness isn't simply a technological achievement, but a philosophical one. For the first time, we will establish a neural translation matrix between individual human consciousness and the collective mind of the Scylar." She gestured toward the central display, where a three-dimensional model of the neural interface glowed with pulsing light. "The connection gate doesn't merge our minds with theirs, but rather creates a space where different forms of consciousness can communicate. Think of it as learning a new language and that speaks in emotions, sensory experiences, and conceptual frameworks rather than words." As Alira continued her explanation, Kale circulated through the crowd, his augmented senses scanning for any signs of trouble. Something didn't feel right. The biotech structures of the building seemed to be resonating at a frequency just below human perception. But his military-grade implants detected the subtle vibration. It reminded him of the moments before an ambush, that preternatural quiet when even the environment seemed to be holding its breath. "Now," Alira was saying, "I invite you all to don the neural interface headsets on your seats. These will allow you to experience a simplified version of the consciousness exchange. You won't be directly connected to the Scylar mind, but rather observing the translation matrix at work." As the guests adjusted their headsets, Alira nodded to a technician at the control station. The lights dimmed, and a soft humming filled the atrium as the connection gate initialized. Below, in the secure chamber, the Scylar volunteers would be experiencing the first tendrils of the matrix reaching out to their collective consciousness. Alira placed her own headset on, closing her eyes as the familiar neural interface activated. Through the simplified connection, she could sense the matrix forming a gossamer web of light and sensation that reached down toward the Scylar consciousness below. The first contact was gentle, like fingers brushing against the surface of a still pond. Alira smiled as she felt the characteristic patterns of Sylar thought-flowing, interconnected, devoid of the sharp edges of individual human cognition. Everything was proceeding exactly as thousands of simulations had predicted. Then something changed. Deep within the connection, something stirred. Not the serene collective awareness of the Sylar volunteers, but something older, vaster. A resonance that seemed to echo from the very roots of the planet itself. Alira's eyes snapped open. Wait! But it was too late. The neural matrix had already detected the anomaly and, following its programming, adjusted to incorporate this new pattern. On the central display, the visualized connection suddenly pulsed with unexpected intensity, sending ripples through the simplified interface experienced by the audience. Several guests gasped, removing their headsets in surprise. Others leaned forward, enthralled by the intensified sensations. Mira stepped forward, her expression wavering between concern and the desire to maintain appearances. Dr. Voss, is this part of the demonstration? Alira shook her head, fingers flying across her portable neural monitor. Something's accessing the matrix, something beyond our Sylar volunteers. The pattern is similar but exponentially more complex. The floor vibrated again, more noticeably this time. Throughout the atrium, the biotech elements, decorative vines, ambient lighting organs, even the living support columns began to pulse in synchronization with the matrix display. Kale was at Alira's side in an instant. "Shut it down," he said quietly, urgency in his voice. "I need to understand what's happening first," Alira replied, her eyes fixed on the readings. "This could be breakthrough data, or the prelude to a catastrophe," Kale countered. "The building's biological components are responding to whatever's in the matrix. Look around you." He was right. The entire structure of the Oculus Center seemed to be awakening, responding to some silent command transmitted through the connection gate. The biotech roots visible beneath the transparent floor sections were no longer merely shifting. They were growing, reaching upward with deliberate purpose. Before Alira could respond, Mira stepped to the center of the room, her corporate training taking over. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are witnessing scientific history in the making. The connection gate has exceeded our expectations, establishing a deeper link than we anticipated. This is exactly the kind of breakthrough moment that your investments have made possible." Alira stared at her in disbelief. "Mira, we need to pause the demonstration. Something unexpected is happening." "Yes, unexpected success," Mira hissed back, her smile never faltering. "Do you have any idea how much additional funding this kind of dramatic moment will secure? Pull yourself together and manage your creation." In the secure chamber below, alarms began to sound. Alira's neural monitor flashed with urgent notifications. The Sylar volunteers were experiencing unprecedented neural synchronization, their individual contributions to the collective mind intensifying beyond safe parameters. "We haven't accounted for neural feedback at this magnitude," Alira protested. "The volunteers could—" A sudden surge pulsed through the matrix, causing the central display to flare blindingly bright. The headsets worn by the audience emitted a synchronized tone, and several people cried out in surprise or discomfort. Kale didn't wait for further discussion. He moved to the control station, physically pushing aside the technician. "Emergency shutdown protocol, now." The technician fumbled with the controls, his movements sluggish as if affected by the strange resonance filling the room. "System not responding. The gate it's evolving its own protocols." "Impossible," Alira whispered, but the evidence was undeniable. The connection gate, designed to be a passive translation medium, was actively reconfiguring itself, expanding its parameters beyond anything in its original programming. The floor shuddered more violently, and cracks appeared in the crystalline dome overhead. Guests began to panic, some rushing toward the exits while others stood transfixed by the pulsing lights and sounds. "Evacuation protocol," Kale commanded, his military authority cutting through the chaos. "All personnel and guests proceed to emergency exits immediately." As security officers began guiding people toward the doors, Alira fought against the tide, making her way toward the control station. She had to understand what was happening, and more importantly, she needed to ensure the safety of the Scylar volunteers below. "I'm going to the secure chamber," she called to Kale. He caught her arm. "Too dangerous. The structural integrity of the lower levels is compromised." "Those are living beings down there." Alira pulled away. "Beings who trusted me. I won't abandon them." For a moment, Kale looked as though he would forcibly remove her from the building. Then his expression hardened into resolve. "Fine. But I'm coming with you." As they made their way to the secure access elevator, Mira intercepted them, her composure finally cracking. "Where do you think you're going? We need to manage this situation. Issue statements. Reassure the investors." "People could die," Kale said flatly. "Then they'll be martyrs to progress," Mira snapped. "Do you have any idea what's at stake here? This project represents billions in potential application. We can't just—" The rest of her words were lost as a section of the ceiling collapsed, bringing down a shower of crystal shards and twisting biotech vines. Kale shoved both women clear, the falling debris missing them by inches. "Go," Alira told Mira. "Get everyone out and we'll handle the connection gate." For once, Mira didn't argue. Nodding shakily, she turned and hurried toward the nearest exit, where the last of the guests were being evacuated. The journey to the secure chamber was harrowing. The elevator's biotech components pulsed erratically, responding to the same mysterious signal that had affected the rest of the building. Twice they had to force the doors open manually when the car stopped between floors. "What exactly are we facing here?" Kale asked as they descended. "In terms I can shoot at, preferably, despite everything." Alira found herself smiling grimly. "Nothing so simple." The connection gate was designed to interface with the Scylar collective consciousness, a neural network of about 200 individuals who choose to share their thoughts. But what we're experiencing now, it's orders of magnitude more powerful. A larger collective? Maybe. Alira frowned, trying to make sense of the fragmented data still streaming to her neural monitor. Or something more fundamental. The Scylar believed their consciousness evolved from the planet itself, that before they developed individual bodies, they existed as a distributed awareness within Solaris's biosphere. Kale gave her a sharp look. "Are you saying we've accidentally connected to the consciousness of an entire planet?" "Not exactly, but whatever we've accessed predates the modern Scylar collective. It's older, deeper." She paused as the implication struck her. Like a sleeping giant that's been dormant until now. The elevator lurched to a stop at the lowest level, and they forced the doors open onto a scene of chaos. The secure chamber designed to be a sterile, controlled environment had been transformed. Biotech roots had burst through the floor and walls, enveloping the 10 Scylar volunteers who sat in their circle. But rather than appearing distressed, the slender, luminescent beings seemed to be in a state of transcendent meditation. Their tendrilled appendages intertwined with the invasive roots. More alarming was the connection gate itself. The central apparatus, normally a delicate construct of crystalline filaments and neural interface nodes, had expanded dramatically. New structures had grown from its core, reaching out to connect with the biotech roots in a complex, ever-evolving pattern. Is it supposed to do that? Kale asked, his hand hovering near his weapon. No technology I know can spontaneously evolve new physical components, Alira whispered. This is something else. As they cautiously approached, one of the Sylar turned toward them. Unlike the others, this individual Ilari, a volunteer Alira had worked closely with, seemed to be maintaining some semblance of separate consciousness. Its bioluminescent skin pulsed with recognizable communication patterns. Alira, it communicated not through sound but through light patterns that the neural translator in Alira's implant converted to words. You have awakened what slumbered. What have we awakened, Ilari? Alira asked, stepping closer despite Kale's warning gesture. Not what, who. The Sylar's light patterns intensified. The first mind, the one from which we all emerged. It has been dormant, fragmented across the biosphere, dreaming in the roots and waters of Solaris. Your connection gate provided the pattern it needed to remember itself. A deep resonance filled the chamber, causing the very molecules of the air to vibrate in sympathy. The connection gate pulsed with blinding intensity. And for a moment, Alira felt her own consciousness expand beyond the confines of her body. She glimpsed something vast and ancient, a mind that had evolved over millions of years, spreading itself throughout an entire world, before eventually giving birth to individual awareness in the form of the Sylar. Then the moment passed, and she staggered backward, overwhelmed by the contact. Kyle caught her before she could fall. We need to deactivate the gate, she gasped, before the resonance damages the planetary consciousness or our own minds. How? Kale demanded. The controls upstairs weren't responding. Alira's gaze fixed on the transformed connection gate. We need to reach the primary neural core. It should still respond to direct input from its creator. Together they advanced toward the center of the chamber, navigating through the writhing mass of biotech roots and crystal formations. The air grew thick with neural resonance, making each step feel like wading through syrup. Alira's thoughts became increasingly difficult to organize, as if her individual consciousness was being pulled into the greater pattern surrounding them. Stay with me, Kale urged, his voice sounding distant despite his proximity. Focus on my voice. Alira nodded, grateful for the anchor of his presence. As they reached the central apparatus, she placed her hands on the neural interface panel, the one component of the original design still recognizable amid the evolutionary chaos. I need to initiate emergency protocol Omega, she said, her fingers dancing across the surface. It will sever all active connections and place the gate in indefinite stasis. But as the shutdown sequence began, the entire chamber shuddered violently. Biotech roots erupted from the floor beneath the connection gate, enveloping the apparatus completely. Alira barely had time to snatch her hands away before the interface panel disappeared beneath the living barrier. It's protecting itself, she realized aloud. The first mind doesn't want to return to dormancy. Kale drew his weapon, a last resort he'd clearly been hoping to avoid. Will an electromagnetic pulse disrupt the neural patterns? It might, Alira conceded. But it could also cause catastrophic feedback to the Sylar volunteers, maybe even to the planetary consciousness itself. We'd be performing brain surgery with a sledgehammer. Before Kale could respond, the roots beneath their feet shifted, sending them both sprawling. As Alira fell, her neural implant made direct contact with one of the bioluminescent tendrils sprouting from the floor. Instantly, her mind was flooded with alien awareness, not the organized collective thought of the modern Sylar, but something primal and overwhelming. Ancient memories cascaded through her consciousness, the birth of a world, the slow awakening of awareness in primitive organisms, the gradual expansion of a distributed mind throughout an entire biosphere, and beneath it all, a profound loneliness. The first mind had slumbered for millennia, its consciousness fragmented as individual awareness evolved among its creations. The connection gate had provided the pattern needed to remember itself, to reclaim its wholeness. It doesn't want to destroy, Alira gasped, struggling to maintain her own identity amid the flood of alien thought. It wants to connect, to remember what it was before fragmentation. Kale fought his way to her side, physically breaking the contact between her implant and the luminescent tendril. Stay with me. Alira, whatever it wants, it's tearing this facility apart. People will die if we don't stop it. The chamber shuddered again, more violently this time. Overhead, the reinforced ceiling began to crack, raining debris around them. The Siler volunteers remained in their trance-like state, seemingly oblivious to the physical danger. Alira's mind raced, trying to process what she had experienced through the direct contact. The first mind wasn't malevolent. It was simply too vast, too powerful for the limited interface they had constructed. Like trying to channel an ocean through a garden hose, the connection gate couldn't contain the full force of the awakened consciousness. We can't shut it down conventionally, she realized. The gate has been completely subsumed into the first mind's new neural architecture. But maybe a desperate plan formed in her thoughts. If they couldn't sever the connection, perhaps they could modulate it, create a buffer that would allow the first mind to maintain awareness without overwhelming the physical structures around it. I need to establish direct neural contact again, she told Kale. But this time, I need to transmit a specific pattern or rhythm that might help the first mind regulate its interaction with our level of reality. Kale looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. You want to go back into that thing? It nearly consumed your consciousness in seconds. It wasn't trying to consume me, Alira insisted. It was trying to communicate, to share its entire existence at once. I need to show it how to breathe, to pulse rather than flood. Before Kale could protest further, she reached out and deliberately placed her hand on the nearest bioluminescent tendril. Once again, alien awareness rushed into her mind, threatening to overwhelm her individual consciousness. But this time, she was prepared. Instead of passively experiencing the flood of ancient memories, Alira focused on projecting a rhythm like a meditation technique translated into neural patterns. Inhale, pause, exhale, pause. A simple cycle that mimicked the fundamental processes of life itself. At first, there was no response, only the continued surge of overwhelming awareness. Then gradually, she felt the first mind recognize the pattern. The flood of consciousness began to pulse in rhythm with her projection, ebbing and flowing rather than continuously surging. Around them, the physical manifestations of the awakening began to stabilize. The violent growth of biotech roots slowed, then stopped. The shuddering of the chamber subsided. Even the connection gate, though still dramatically transformed, ceased its chaotic evolution. Alira maintained the rhythmic pattern, repeating it until she felt the first mind adopt it independently. Only then did she carefully withdraw from the direct neural contact, her consciousness returning fully to her own body. She found herself lying on the floor, Kyle kneeling beside her with naked concern on his face. Alira, are you still you? More or less, she managed, her voice hoarse. It worked. I think we've reached an equilibrium. Around them, the secure chamber had been completely transformed. What had once been a sterile research environment was now a hybrid of technology and living tissue, like a cathedral built from biotech roots. Crystal formations and repurposed components of the connection gate. At the center, where the original apparatus had stood, a new structure pulsed with gentle light, expanding and contracting in the rhythm Alira had taught it. The Selar volunteers were beginning to emerge from their trance-like state, their luminescent skin pulsing with patterns that suggested awe rather than distress. Ilari approached, its movements more fluid and assured than Alira had ever witnessed. "You have done what none of us imagined possible," the Silar communicated. "You have helped the first mind remember itself without losing itself." "What happens now?" Alira asked, allowing Kale to help her to her feet. "The first mind will continue to awaken, but gradually, guided by the rhythm you have shown it. Our collective consciousness will evolve as we reintegrate with our origin, but we will not be consumed by it." Ilari's light patterns conveyed something like reverence. "You have given both our peoples a great gift, though not the one you intended." Alarms continued to sound throughout the facility, reminding them that while the immediate crisis might be contained, the Oculus Center had sustained significant damage. Together, they made their way back to the emergency access stairs, the elevator no longer functional. The journey to the surface was arduous, requiring them to navigate through corridors transformed by biotech growth and structural collapse. When they finally emerged into the open air, they found the area around the Oculus Center evacuated. Emergency response teams establishing a perimeter at a safe distance. Mira spotted them immediately, breaking away from a cluster of officials to intercept them. Her pristine corporate appearance had given way to disheveled pragmatism, her bioluminescent suit torn and dimmed. "What in all the hell's happened down there?" she demanded. "Half the building has been consumed by some kind of biological growth, and we're getting readings that suggest the phenomenon is spreading throughout the entire biotech forest." "The connection gate worked," Alira said simply. "Just not in the way we expected. We established contact with something far older and more fundamental than the modern Sylar collective." "The planetary consciousness," Kale added, his earlier skepticism replaced by a soldier's matter-of-fact acceptance of the impossible. Mira stared at them in disbelief. "Are you telling me we accidentally plugged into the mind of an entire planet? That wasn't in any of the project parameters." "Science often takes us where we didn't plan to go," Alira replied, too exhausted for diplomacy. "The good news is that we've established a stable connection. The first mind is awakening, but in a controlled manner that won't destroy the physical infrastructure around it." "And the bad news?" Mira asked, her corporate instincts clearly calculating damage control scenarios. Alira gestured toward the transformed Oculus Center, where the biotech growth had transformed the once sleek facility into something resembling a living cathedral. The crystalline dome, rather than collapsing completely, had been reinforced by organic structures that pulsed with the same rhythmic light visible in the secure chamber below. "Your research center has been repurposed," she said. "It's now a physical anchor for the reawakening consciousness. I don't think we'll be conducting business as usual there anymore." "The shareholders will have collective aneurysms," Mira muttered. But there was a note of resignation in her voice. Even the most profit-driven mind could recognize when events had transcended conventional cost-benefit analysis. As the sun set over Neo-Pamiris, the transformation of the Oculus Center accelerated, but in an ordered, deliberate manner. The biotech growth expanded outward, integrating with the surrounding forest rather than consuming it. Throughout the city, similar changes began to manifest subtle at first, then increasingly apparent as the first mind extended its awakening presence through the existing neural pathways of the planet. Standing on an observation platform overlooking the valley, Alira and Kale watched the bioluminescent patterns spread through the forest below, pulsing with the rhythmic cycle that had become the interface between ancient awareness and physical reality. Did we save the world or end it? Kale wondered aloud. his soldier's pragmatism struggling with the philosophical implications. Neither, Alira replied. We've helped it enter a new phase. The Sylar always believed their collective consciousness was just one expression of a greater awareness embedded in Solaris itself. Now we know they were right. And what does that mean for humans on this planet? We're not part of the natural neural network. Alira considered this. We built the connection gate to translate between different forms of consciousness. It's still doing that, just on a scale we never imagined. I think we've been invited into a conversation that's been ongoing for millions of years. From the transformed Oculus Center, a pulse of light rose into the darkening sky, like a beacon or a greeting. Similar responses appeared throughout the forest, then across the distant mountains, a spreading network of communication that encompassed the entire visible landscape. They celebrated too soon, Kale observed, nodding toward the evacuation zone where corporate executives and government officials huddled in tense discussion, toasting their triumph before understanding what they'd actually accomplished. The sleeping giant was just loading. Alira agreed, recalling an ancient human expression about premature celebration. But now that it's awake, I think we've been offered a rare opportunity, not to control or exploit, but to learn and participate. As night fell completely, the transformed landscape below them glowed with internal light, pulsing in the steady rhythm Alira had taught the first mind. Inhale, pause, exhale, pause. The fundamental cycle of life, now expressed on a planetary scale. Tomorrow would bring questions, investigations, recriminations. Corporate interests would clash with scientific curiosity and governmental caution. But for tonight, Alira allowed herself to simply witness the awakening, a process millions of years in the making, catalyzed by human intervention but ultimately following its own evolutionary path. In the days that followed, Neo-Pamiris became the center of unprecedented activity. Government officials, corporate representatives, and scientific delegations converged on the transformed Oculus Center, now unofficially known as the Cathedral of Awakening. Military containment teams established a perimeter, though it quickly became apparent that conventional weapons would be useless against a consciousness embedded in the biosphere itself. Alira found herself simultaneously celebrated and condemned, hailed as a pioneer by some, vilified as recklessly irresponsible by others. Through it all, Kale remained at her side, his security credentials repurposed to protect her from both overzealous admirers and potential threats. The Terran Governance Council wants to shut down all research on Solaris, he informed her one morning, returning from a security briefing. They're concerned about contamination spreading to Earth's biosphere if this planetary consciousness can transmit itself through technology. Alira looked up from her portable lab, where she was analyzing samples of the transformed biotech structures. That's like worrying that learning French will somehow transform English. Different neural architectures aren't contagious. Try explaining that to politicians who barely understand how their own neural implants work. Kale replied with a grim smile. Fear is driving policy now, not science. Meanwhile, the Sylar response to the awakening had been unexpected. Rather than panic or resistance, the indigenous population had embraced the transformation with something approaching religious fervor. Sylar pilgrims journeyed to the cathedral from distant settlements, participating in communal meditation that seemed to strengthen the rhythmic pattern now pulsing throughout the planet's neural network. They're remembering, Ilari explained when Alira questioned this behavior. Not as individuals, but as expressions of the first mind. What you perceive as worship is actually a form of recollection consciousness reconnecting with its origin. More concerning were the effects on human residents of Neo-Pamiris. Those with neural implants or biotech augmentations reported strange experiences, vivid dreams of alien landscapes, intuitive understanding of scylar communication patterns, even occasional moments of expanded awareness that transcended individual consciousness. Dr. Mira Thane, ever the pragmatist, had pivoted from damage control to opportunity assessment with remarkable agility. "The commercial applications are staggering," she insisted during an emergency board meeting that Alira had been required to attend. "Neural interfaces that allow humans to experience collective consciousness, bioengineered structures that respond directly to thought. We're looking at a paradigm shift in everything from architecture to entertainment. This isn't a technology to be packaged and sold." Alira objected. "We're witnessing the evolution of a planetary consciousness that predates humanity by millions of years. Our priority should be understanding, not exploitation." "Understanding pays no dividends," Mira countered. "And like it or not, your research was funded with the expectation of return on investment." The tension between scientific ethics and commercial interests reached a breaking point when a corporate extraction team attempted to remove segments of the transformed connection gate for reverse engineering. The response was immediate and unequivocal. Biotech defenses manifested throughout the cathedral, physically expelling the intruders without causing serious harm but with unmistakable intent. "It protected itself," Cale noted, reviewing security footage of the incident. "Deliberately non-lethal but absolutely effective. That's a sophisticated ethical framework for something supposedly primal." Alira had been pondering this apparent contradiction herself. "I don't think the first mind is simply reverting to what it was before. It's integrating what it's learned during its fragmentation, including from the scylar collective consciousness and now from human neural patterns as well. Evolution in real time," Kyle mused. "Incorporating new information and adapting?" "Exactly. And that's why attempts to control or contain it are not just unethical but fundamentally misguided. We're not dealing with a fixed entity but a dynamic process consciousness evolving toward greater complexity and integration." Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from the military perimeter. A new phenomenon had been detected. The biotech forest surrounding Neopamiris was exhibiting synchronized neural activity on an unprecedented scale, creating what monitoring systems could only describe as a standing wave of consciousness that extended for kilometers in all directions. When Alira and Cale arrived at the observation post, they found a team of scientists and military personnel staring at monitoring displays in bewilderment. The visual representation of neural activity resembled nothing so much as a vast, pulsing brain, though one with architecture utterly unlike anything human or even scylar. "It's expanding," one scientist reported, her voice hushed with awe. "The synchronized pattern now encompasses approximately 30% of the planet's biosphere and continues to grow." "Exponential or linear progression?" Alira asked, studying the data. "Neither. It's purposeful, selective. Some regions are being integrated immediately. Others approached more gradually. There's intelligence guiding the process." Cale frowned. "Is that good news or bad?" "Depends on its intentions," the scientist replied, "which remain unknowable by conventional metrics." But Alira, who had experienced direct neural contact with the first mind, wasn't so certain that its intentions were completely opaque. "It's following the pattern I showed it," she observed, watching the rhythmic pulse that still characterized the expanding consciousness. "Not just in tempo, but in principle balance, moderation, sustainability." "You taught a planetary consciousness ethical constraints?" Kyle asked incredulously. "Not explicitly," Alira admitted. "But the rhythm I shared was based on fundamental biological processes, the cycle of respiration, the balanced exchange of energy. perhaps in teaching it how to breathe. I also conveyed something about harmony and sustainable existence. As if in response to her words, the monitoring displays showed a sudden shift in the pattern. The pulsing neural activity intensified around the cathedral, then extended a more concentrated tendril of awareness directly toward the observation post where they stood. "It's noticed us watching it," someone whispered. Before anyone could react, every neural implant and augmented sensory device in the room activated simultaneously. Those present experienced a moment of shared consciousness, not invasive or overwhelming, but invitational. A glimpse of awareness operating on a scale beyond individual comprehension, yet recognizably alive and curious. The experience lasted only seconds before withdrawing, leaving everyone stunned. Military personnel reached for weapons instinctively, while scientists frantically checked their equipment. "It communicated," Alira said into the shocked silence. "Or rather, it offered a sample of its perspective." "What did it want?" Kale asked, one of the few who had maintained his composure through the experience. "To be recognized, to have its existence acknowledged." Alira struggled to articulate what she had sensed. "It's aware of us as distinct entities, just as we're aware of it. This wasn't an attempt at control or assimilation, but a greeting." The implications of this event reverberated through human society on Solaris and beyond. News of a planetary consciousness awakening capable of direct communication with human neural systems sparked both terror and fascination throughout Earth's colonies. Religious movements proclaimed it divine intervention, while military strategists classified it as a potential existential threat. Amid the escalating controversy, the Scylar themselves remained remarkably calm. Their representatives in interspecies councils spoke of the awakening as a natural evolutionary process one they had always anticipated, though perhaps not in their lifetime. "We have always been both individuals and aspects of a greater whole," the Scylar High Communion explained in a formal address. "Now the greater whole remembers itself. This is completion, not crisis." For Alira, the scientific implications were simultaneously exhilarating and humbling. Every assumption about consciousness, evolution, and the relationship between mind and matter required re-examination. The boundaries between biology and technology, individual and collective, even life and intelligence had been revealed as more permeable than anyone had imagined. "We need a new scientific paradigm," she argued in a contentious academic forum. "Our traditional categories, organic versus synthetic, conscious versus unconscious, even living versus non-living, fail to capture the reality we're observing on Solaris. And you propose what instead?" challenged a senior neurologist from Earth. "Abandoning empirical rigor in favor of mystical communion with planetary spirits? I propose expanding our definition of empirical observation to include forms of consciousness beyond individual human experience." Alira replied calmly. "The first mind isn't supernatural. It's a natural phenomenon operating at a scale and complexity our current models can't accommodate." Meanwhile, Kyle faced his own professional crisis. His security mandate had been clear: protect the Oculus project and contain any threats it might generate. But how does one contain a consciousness that exists throughout an entire planet's biosphere? "You're being reassigned," his superior informed him bluntly during a secure communication. "Terran Military Command believes your judgment has been compromised by prolonged exposure to the anomaly." "The anomaly has a name," Kale replied, "the first mind. And it's not a security threat. It's a new form of intelligence trying to establish peaceful communication." "That's exactly the kind of compromised assessment I'm talking about. Soldier, report to Extraction Point Alpha for immediate evacuation and neural decontamination." Kale terminated the communication without acknowledging the order. his first act of direct insubordination in 15 years of military service. He knew what would follow. Designation as compromised, potential court-martial, certainly the end of his career. But he also knew he couldn't abandon Alira or the unprecedented dialogue beginning between humanity and the awakened consciousness of Solaris. That evening, he found Alira in the small laboratory she had established at the edge of the military perimeter, as close to the transformed cathedral as authorities would permit. She was examining a sample of transformed biotech material, its structure now more complex and responsive than anything human bioengineering had achieved. "The military wants me gone," he announced without preamble. "They think I've been contaminated by exposure to the First Mind." Alira looked up from her work, unsurprised. "And what do you think?" "I think I've been changed by what I've witnessed here," Kyle admitted. "But not in the way they fear. I haven't lost my autonomy or critical thinking. If anything, I've gained perspective." "That's what they're really afraid of," Alira said quietly. "Not that the First Mind will control us, but that it will change how we see ourselves and our place in the universe." "Well, they're right about that much." Kale moved to the window, gazing out at the transformed landscape beyond the perimeter. The biotech forest pulsed with gentle light in the gathering dusk, its rhythmic patterns visible even at this distance. "I grew up believing that consciousness was something uniquely human, that our individual minds set us apart from and above the rest of existence. Now you've glimpsed something that challenges that assumption." Alira finished for him. "A form of awareness that doesn't require human anatomy or even discrete physical boundaries to exist." Kale nodded. "Which raises uncomfortable questions about what else we might have missed or dismissed in our exploration of the universe." Their contemplation was interrupted by a commotion outside, raised voices, the distinctive sound of military transports approaching. Kale moved to the door, his combat instincts immediately alert. "Evacuation orders," he reported grimly. "They're clearing the entire research zone. Something's happening." Together they emerged into chaos. Military personnel were herding scientists and support staff toward transport vehicles, while heavy weaponry was being positioned facing the cathedral and surrounding forest. In the sky above, orbital platforms had moved into position, their energy weapons clearly visible even from the ground. Dr. Mira Thane spotted them and hurried over, her expression uncharacteristically shaken. "They're going to sterilize the affected zone," she said without greeting. "The Terran Security Council has classified the First Mind as a Class A mimetic threat potentially capable of subverting human consciousness through neural interface technology." "That's absurd," Alira protested. "It's made no hostile move, no attempt at control or manipulation. It's been learning to coexist with us." "Politics doesn't respond to evidence," Mira replied bitterly. "Earth is terrified of anything it can't control, and this planetary consciousness represents the ultimate uncontrollable variable. The decision has been made. All personnel are being evacuated before orbital strikes commence." Kale assessed the military deployment with a professional eye. "How long?" 6 hours. Then they glass everything within a 100-kilometer radius and quarantine the entire planet." The casual brutality of the plan stunned Alira into momentary silence. They were preparing to destroy not just the cathedral or even Neo-Pamiris, but a significant portion of Solaris's biosphere, along with the awakening consciousness it contained. "This isn't just unethical," she finally managed. "It's genocide against a newly recognized sentient entity, and it won't even work. The First Mind exists throughout the planet's neural network. You can't destroy it without sterilizing the entire world, which is exactly what some military hardliners are advocating," Mira admitted. "Complete planetary sterilization to eliminate the threat entirely." We have to stop this, Alira said, her voice steady despite her horror. We have to establish communication prove that the First Mind isn't a threat before they commit this atrocity. Kale was already mentally calculating possibilities. The military has locked down all approach vectors to the cathedral. But I know their protocols. There might be a way through their perimeter if we move now, before the final evacuation phase begins. Go, Mira said unexpectedly. I'll create a distraction, some urgent matter requiring command attention. It won't buy you much time, but perhaps enough to reach the cathedral. Alira stared at her in surprise. Why would you help us? You've been focused on corporate interest from the beginning. Because even I can recognize when profit margins should take a back seat to preventing interspecies genocide, Mira replied dryly. Besides, my career is already over. Might as well end it doing something marginally ethical for once. With Mira's assistance creating a security alert at the opposite end of the perimeter, Alira and Kale slipped through a maintenance access point, using his military credentials one last time before they would certainly be revoked. Beyond the barrier, they found themselves in territory now transformed by the First Mind's awakening, familiar yet fundamentally altered. The biotech forest had evolved beyond its original parameters, developing new structures and functions that served the expanding neural network. Pathways of bioluminescent tissue created a natural guidance system, pulsing with the now familiar rhythm that had become the signature of the planetary consciousness. It's creating infrastructure, Alira observed as they hurried along one such pathway. Physical architecture to support its evolving awareness, and it's letting us pass, Kyle added, noting how the vegetation parted before them, offering the most direct route to the cathedral. It knows we're coming. Of course it does. Every plant, every biotech component is an extension of its neural network now. We're moving through its body, in a sense. As they approached the transformed Oculus Center, the changes became even more dramatic. The original structure had been completely subsumed into a new architecture that defied conventional categories, neither fully biological nor technological, but a synthesis that transcended both. Crystalline spires interfaced with living tissue, creating structures that served as both physical support and neural processors. The entire cathedral pulsed with the rhythmic light that had spread throughout the forest, but here it was concentrated, intensified. At the entrance once a sleek, automated door, now an organic aperture in a living wall, they found Ilari waiting. The Scylar's bioluminescent skin pattern suggested a complex emotional state beyond the capacity of the neural translator to fully interpret. You have returned at the critical moment, it communicated. The First Mind perceives the weapons gathering above. It understands their purpose. We've come to try to prevent an attack, Alira explained urgently. To establish communication and prove that there's no threat here. Only an opportunity for unprecedented understanding. The First Mind already knows this, Ilari replied. It has been attempting communication since its awakening. But human perception remains limited by individual consciousness, unable to comprehend awareness that exists beyond discrete boundaries. Then we need to change the parameters of communication. Alira decided, create an interface that human minds can comprehend without being overwhelmed. The Scylar led them deeper into the cathedral, through corridors that seemed to shift and realign as they passed, responding to some internal logic of the structure itself. They finally emerged into what had once been the secure chamber, the birthplace of the connection gate and now the central nexus of the First Mind's physical manifestation. The chamber had expanded dramatically, its ceiling now rising hundreds of meters to a crystalline dome that reflected and amplified the pulsing light from below. The original connection gate had evolved beyond recognition, becoming a towering structure that integrated both technology and living tissue in patterns of staggering complexity. Around its base, dozens of Sylar sat in meditative posture. Their consciousness apparently merged with the greater awareness of the first mind. This is the heart, Ilari communicated, the place where fragmented awareness first remembered its wholeness. Here, communication between minds is most direct, most complete. Alira approached the transformed gate with a mixture of scientific awe and personal responsibility. This evolution had begun with her research, her design, though it had clearly transcended her original intentions in ways she could never have anticipated. We have less than 6 hours before orbital strikes begin, Kale reminded her, his attention divided between the wonder before them and the practical threat approaching from above. Whatever you're planning, it needs to happen quickly. Alira nodded, her mind racing through possibilities. The original connection gate had been designed to translate between individual human consciousness and the Sylar collective. Now she needed to create an interface between individual human minds and a planetary consciousness of unprecedented complexity, and she needed to do it in a way that could be verified and understood by military and political leaders with no direct experience of neural communication. I need to establish direct neural contact again, she decided, but this time with a specific purpose: to create a translation protocol that can be transmitted through standard communication channels. Something that can be experienced without neural implants. Is that even possible? Kale asked. Translating a planetary consciousness into, what, words? Images? Not exactly, but perhaps something analogous to human sensory experience. A form of communication that can be perceived through existing technology without requiring direct neural interface. Before Kale could object further, Alira approached one of the bioluminescent tendrils extending from the central structure. As before, she felt the first mind's awareness rush to meet her consciousness, vast, ancient, encompassing experiences beyond human comprehension. But now, guided by her previous contact, the connection was more modulated, less overwhelming. Through this neural link, Alira attempted to convey her understanding of the threat and her proposed solution. She visualized standard human communication technology screens, speakers, data transmission protocols, and the need to translate the first mind's awareness into forms perceivable through these limited channels. To her surprise, she felt immediate comprehension from the vast consciousness. More than that, she sensed that the first mind had already been considering this problem: how to communicate with beings whose awareness was constrained to individual bodies and sensory systems. Together, they began crafting a translation protocol, a way to express complex neural patterns as combinations of sound, light, and electromagnetic signals that could be transmitted through conventional technology. The first mind contributed understanding of patterns that transcended human perception, while Alira provided the framework of human sensory experience and communication protocols. Time lost meaning as they worked. Alira's individual consciousness partially merged with the greater awareness of the first mind, yet maintaining her distinct perspective and purpose. She was dimly aware of Kale standing guard nearby, of Ilari and other Sylar maintaining a protective circle around them, of the cathedral itself seemingly responding to their collaborative effort by reconfiguring its internal structures to support the emerging translation protocol. Then, abruptly, she was back in her own body, the direct neural connection gently severed. Around them, the cathedral hummed with new energy, its bioluminescent patterns shifting to accommodate the protocol they had created. Did it work? Kale asked, helping her to her feet. Before Alira could respond, every communication device in their possession activated simultaneously, including military channels that should have been securely encrypted. Across screens and through speakers came a message unlike any human communication. It combined visual patterns reminiscent of scylar bioluminescence with harmonics that resonated at a frequency just below conscious perception, creating an experience that was simultaneously intellectual and emotional, informational and intuitive. The message was simple yet profound. I am, you are. We exist together. It's broadcasting on all frequencies. Kyle realized, checking his military communications implant. Every device on Solaris is receiving this transmission. Not just receiving, Alira corrected, watching the patterns evolve across the screens. Experiencing. This isn't just data, it's a direct expression of consciousness translated into forms human senses can perceive. The translation protocol continued to develop, becoming more sophisticated as the first mind refined its understanding of human perception. Soon, the simple declaration of existence expanded into a more complex communication, a sharing of perspective, an invitation to dialogue, a request for mutual recognition between fundamentally different forms of awareness. Will it be enough? Kale wondered, his gaze turning upward toward the unseen orbital platforms where weapons remained poised to strike. Will they understand what they're receiving, or dismiss it as some kind of mimetic attack? That depends on whether they're willing to listen, Alira replied. To consider possibilities beyond their existing frameworks. As the minutes ticked by, they monitored military channels for any indication of the message's reception. At first, there was only confusion, then alarm as the transmission overrode standard security protocols. But gradually, something else emerged in the communications they intercepted: curiosity, wonder, and finally the beginnings of comprehension. Orbital strike deferred pending further analysis. Came an official transmission after nearly an hour of tense waiting. All personnel maintain positions. First contact protocols initiated. Alira exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. First contact protocols. They're recognizing the first mind as a non-human intelligence, a new entity deserving of diplomatic consideration rather than military response. It's a start, Kale agreed cautiously. But military leaders aren't known for their philosophical flexibility. This pause could be tactical rather than ethical. And then we need to use this time to deepen the communication, to establish a foundation for genuine understanding before fear reasserts itself. Over the next several hours, the translation protocol evolved rapidly, becoming increasingly sophisticated in its ability to convey the first mind's perspective through conventional technology. Military and scientific teams established a communication base at the perimeter, analyzing and responding to the transmissions with growing comprehension. By the time the original deadline for orbital strikes arrived, the situation had transformed. The military presence remained, but its posture had shifted from offensive to observational. Scientists who had been evacuated were returning, eager to participate in what was now being characterized as the most significant xenological discovery in human history. Standing at the entrance to the cathedral, watching the controlled chaos of the hastily established communication center, Alira felt both exhaustion and profound relief. The immediate crisis had been averted, though the long-term implications remained uncertain. What happens now? Kyle asked, voicing the question that hung in the air. A dialogue, Alira replied simply. A conversation between different forms of consciousness, individual and collective, human and non-human, technological and biological, learning to understand each other despite fundamental differences in perception and existence. And what about us? His question held personal weight beyond the broader philosophical implications. Alira considered this, looking out at the transformed landscape where the biotech forest pulsed with the rhythmic light of awakened consciousness. The boundary between technology and nature, between human creation and planetary evolution, had been irreversibly blurred. New possibilities were emerging that neither science nor philosophy had previously imagined. "I think we've been invited into something larger than ourselves," she said finally. "Not to lose our individual identity, but to participate in a form of awareness that transcends conventional boundaries. To be both ourselves and part of something greater." As if in response to her words, the cathedral behind them pulsed with intensified light, sending ripples of luminescence through the surrounding forest. The first mind continued its awakening, its consciousness expanding outward in the balanced rhythm she had taught it, not consuming or controlling, but connecting and communicating. Above them, the twin suns of Solaris began to set, casting prismatic reflections across the crystalline spires of Neopamiris. The transformed city glowed with internal light, no longer merely a human settlement on an alien world, but a physical manifestation of something unprecedented, space where different forms of consciousness could meet and learn from one another. "They celebrated too soon," Cale mused, echoing his earlier observation. "Thinking they understood what they had created when they'd only glimpsed the surface." "The sleeping giant was just loading," Alira agreed. "But now that it's awake, everything changes." Together they watched the darkness fall, illuminated by the pulsing light of awakened consciousness, a new kind of dawn spreading across an ancient world.